are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Paul Trammell. Paul, who lives on a sailboat, is the author of 3 novels and multiple nonfiction books. I'm here with Paul Trammell, an author who is joining the Heartland Author Podcast from a sailboat. Paul, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
All right. Well, I am a sailor and an author. I live full-time on my sailboat. I don't own anything on land. I gave up living. I gave up my house and my car and my job and everything else on land in 2019, and I've been sailing ever since. And I write, and I sail by myself, so it's a great environment for writing. I write both nonfiction and fiction. I write about things that I do, places I've been, sailing nonfiction, basically sailing adventures. And I also write novels. And my latest is a thriller called Until They Bury Me. And I'm talking to you from Bocas del Toro, Panama right now.
Okay, now without spoiling too much of your books, what are some of your more notable books about? And you mentioned your most recent thriller.
Yeah, Until They Bury Me is about a guy who meets reconnects with an old girlfriend who he was in love with when he was in college. And she lives in a city, and he moves to the city he basically needs a new life. He needs to start over, and he runs into her, and she's glamorous and beautiful and lives in a big city, and he thinks she's rich. So he goes to visit her and spends some time with her, and they elope, and all of a sudden they're married. And then he slowly comes to realize that she's schizophrenic, and nothing is really as he thought it was. And then she's not rich, so he has to get a job, and he ends up getting involved with the mafia, and one thing leads to another. And it's a wild story with a lot of twists and turns and a very unpredictable ending. And and that's Until They Bury Me. My most recent sailing nonfiction is called Sailing to Newfoundland, and that is all about a journey I did last summer. I sailed from Florida solo to Canada, and then up into the fjords of southern Newfoundland, which is a wild, uninhabited place. The whole south coast of Newfoundland is virtually mostly uninhabited, and it's full of fjords. It's a place where wild, stark nature meets the ocean, and there's very few people up there. And so that was an amazing adventure. That's my latest sailing book, and I'm working on another novel right now. I'm always writing. Typically I'm always writing a fiction and a nonfiction, although right now I'm just writing a fiction. So those are my latest 2 books anyway.
Now, do you approach writing a fiction book differently than you do for a nonfiction book? Because I'm usually a plotter for the fiction works I'm currently writing, but much less so for the nonfiction works I'm currently writing.
So you write nonfiction and fiction too, huh?
Yeah, I've only published one fiction book. That was about 4 years ago, and I did not plot that at all. But I'm plotting for fiction works that I'm currently writing. But for nonfiction books I'm currently writing, I am not much of a plotter for nonfiction.
Right. They're completely different. I think plotting is great for fiction. I plot what I can, and it's very basic, and then of course there's a whole lot of writing by the seat of my pants as well. But for the most part, I've got a basic idea of my story worked out in my head before I start a novel. And for the nonfiction, it's completely different. I journal. So when I'm writing a nonfiction, I am writing about an adventure that I'm doing. And I basically just journal every day. And the journal becomes the rough draft. And that eventually becomes a book. So yeah, two completely different ways of writing. And both infinitely interesting.
Now, are all your books self-published, or all your books traditionally published, or are some self-published and others traditionally published?
All of my books, and I've published 10, all are self-published. Yeah, I've never even tried to get a publisher. I listened to a lot of interviews with authors, and none of them have convinced me yet that it's worth my trouble to try to get traditionally published. What do you think?
I'm going entirely the self-published route for every book I'm writing now. My first book was self-published as well, but I wasn't in the best state of mind when I wrote it. Basically every other book I write from here on out is going to be much better than that one.
All right. Yeah. Well, that's as it should be. My third novel is a lot better than my first novel, no doubt about it.
Now, if you have anything to add, because you've kind of hinted at this a few times in this interview already, where do your ideas for stories come from?
Well, they all come from my life. My first novel is called Dead Flowers on Wednesday, and it is about a band on tour. And it's very loosely based on a band I was in, and we did a tour in a veggie bus. We called it the veggie bus. It was a school bus converted into a tour bus, and it ran on used vegetable oil. And of course, I had to write a book about that. It was a reggae band I was in, and we were, it was very seat of our pants, low budget tour, just playing bars and small festivals and little clubs throughout Appalachia. We started in Florida and went up through Appalachia all the way up to West Virginia and out to North Carolina and back. And I started writing a nonfiction about it, and then quickly realized it would be much more fun to write fiction. So that's where that book came from. The next novel I wrote is called The Gold Box, and it's all about a guy who is spearfishing in the Bahamas, which is something I've spent a lot of time doing. And he finds a piece of treasure. He finds a small piece of gold, which is something I'm always thinking about. I'm always looking, because I'm there anyway. I'm on the bottom of the ocean looking around reefs, looking for fish and lobster. Why not look for gold too, right? So there's a lot of questions that come up. If you find a piece of gold and you're freediving, well, what do you do? Who do do you tell anybody? What if you have friends with you? What if you have two friends with you in a small boat in a dinghy, and you find a piece of gold? Are you going to show it to them, or are you going to hide it? Is it going to be an immediate secret? Because as soon as you show it to somebody, the danger increases. There's a whole lot of risks all of a sudden pop up. But are you going to be able to keep it a secret? So that's sort of the question that book asks, and it runs down the adventure that happens when you find a piece of gold, and of course he finds more, and there's a whole lot more to that story. But basically like things I think about. That's how that one came up. And then this last story, Until They Bury Me, it all started when I was riding in the car with my father. I was visiting my parents, and there was a truck, an SUV, in their parking garage. They live in a city, and in this parking garage was a truck, a black Hummer, that was double parked. Right, so you never see a car in a parking garage taking up two spaces. Right, it's very unusual. Not only that, the truck was covered in dust, as if it hadn't moved in a long time. And my parents said that it had always been there. So that's very curious. That got me thinking. Well, what's up with that truck? It's got to be somebody who's above the law to be able to do that. And of course, I just started thinking up a story that went along with it. And then I brought into some of my own life experiences with people I knew who were schizophrenic. And it just sort of snowballed. And within a few hours, I had this entire story in my head, and I had to write it. And I developed it into what is now the novel Until They Bury Me.
Why do you love writing?
I love art, and I love creativity, and writing is I think in my life it's the ultimate art. I've been a painter, I've been a sculptor, I've spent 23 years as a performing musician, and now I write. On the one hand, it's the most interesting, most creative form of art that I've attempted yet. And on the other hand, it's something you can do. It works very well on a sailboat. So living, I want to live at sea. I don't intend to go back to land anytime soon. and it's a great occupation for somebody who lives on a sailboat, particularly alone like myself. I have plenty of time. I live in a creative environment, and it's peaceful and quiet. Whenever I want it to be peaceful and quiet, it is peaceful and quiet. So I have all the time I want in order to write. But I love it because you can not only create, you can create anything. You're completely unbounded by any rules. You can like when you paint, you have to paint something that's with actual paint, with colors and on a thing. When you write, you can make up anything. It can be any story you want. You can get into people's heads. You can change the world. Two of my books are about alcohol and drug addiction because I'm sober. I'm 8 years sober. And, I spent most of my life partying hard and living a very unhealthy life. And I'm over that now. And I've written 2 books about that. The latest is called The Joy of Living Clean and Sober. That's exactly what it's about. And, you can really change the world as a writer. Writing gets into people's heads. It forms stories in their heads. It forms pictures in their heads. And your books, they create new ways of thinking in people's heads. They slowly help mold not just one person, but thousands of people. So it's powerful. And with power comes responsibility. I feel like writers have responsibilities. I feel like anybody that has a platform has a responsibility to positively affect the world. And, at least 2 of the books I've written, the 2 about drug addiction, certainly do that. And all my sailing nonfiction, encourage people to get out and chase their dreams and appreciate nature. And I hope my novels as well affect people in a positive way.
Now, I'm going to mention here, I don't really like talking about alcoholism because my late father was an alcoholic. Now, he got sober before I was born, so I was fortunate to never have to deal with my dad as an alcoholic, but my brother, who's 19 and a half years older than me, had the misfortune of dealing with my dad when he was on booze, and I've never asked my brother about what that was like because that might bring back too much trauma for him, emotional trauma. Now, without spoiling too much of your book about your about getting sober, how did you become sober?
Well, I tried 3 times to quit drinking. So by the time I was about to quit the 3rd time, I had known for a few years that I was drinking too much. So it was in my head, at some point you've got to quit. But it's a scary thought to somebody who's addicted to a drug. It's scary to think about quitting because it's going to be miserable, and you don't know. If anything good's going to come of it. You think it's going to, your mind just tricks you into thinking everything's going to be bad if you quit. So it was scary, but I knew I needed to do it. And it was the influence of one other person. I ran into a friend of mine at a party. He didn't have a beer in his hand, so I offered him one, and he said, "No, I quit." He said, "I've been sober for a year now." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, tell me how you did it. Why'd you do it?" And he said, "My brother died." I was like, "Oh my God." So it turns out his brother, who was younger than me at the time, died from drinking. From not from one night of drinking too much, but from a life, from 40 years of heavy liquor drinking. His internal organs failed. He died a long, slow, miserable death that dragged out over a number of years, and that caused Jim, his brother, to quit. And Jim told me that. And Jim's standing there, well-dressed, clean-looking, happy, healthy-looking. Everybody else at the party looks like a dirtbag compared to him. And I just thought, like, man, I need to do what Jim's doing. So the next day, I was terribly hungover. I skipped work. I stayed home and watched Netflix and ate pizza from Domino's, and it was just a terrible day. And I thought, that's it. I'm done. I called a therapist. I booked an appointment. And decided I was going to start the next day, because I still had a couple of beers in the fridge and I drank them. But I decided this is it. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to quit drinking forever. And by golly, I did it. And thank God I did, because I was going downhill, and I've been going uphill since then. And my life is so much better now. It's incredible. Like now, here I am living out my dream, living on a sailboat in Panama, sailing to wherever I want, supporting myself as a writer, finally making a living as an artist. That's what sobriety does. It makes your dreams come true, turns your life right around.
I have one more writing-related question, then I've got another question after that. But what is your typical writing routine like?
I like to get up early in the morning. I like to write first thing in the morning. That's what I've been doing lately anyway. When I'm writing a nonfiction, I'm journaling, and that usually takes place at the end of the day, where I document what happened that day. But for writing fiction, I think it works better to get up first thing in the morning. I make coffee, and I take my computer up onto the deck of the cockpit of my boat. So I'm sitting outside as the sun's rising. My mind is fresh because I just woke up, and I write. I try to write. Right now I'm still writing the rough draft. I might have just finished the rough draft of this novel, but that's what I've been doing, writing the rough draft, where you're making stuff up, you're being creative. And so I like to write first thing in the morning. This is a new thing I've been doing, new this year anyway. When I wake up in the middle of the night and can't fall back asleep, I just get up and make a cup of coffee and open the computer and sit down and write for an hour. And after an hour, excuse me, and then I go back to bed, But like I realized, I heard somebody else say that. Somebody said, I have a 20-minute rule. If I'm awake for 20 minutes, I go ahead and get up and do something. And he said, I do something creative for an hour or two. I thought, well, I'm going to try that because, probably 1 out of every 10 nights, I'll wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. and just be awake for an hour, no matter what I do. So I've started doing that, and it's great. You get up, you make a cup of coffee, you open the computer. It's totally dark and quiet outside, and I write for an hour. And then when I start feeling tired again, I go back to sleep and wake up, a few hours later and get on with my day. But yeah, every day, I think it's important to write every day. And I think however you do it, it's important to have a routine. Because one of the most important things about writing, especially fiction, where you have to make stuff up, your mind is going to try to trick you into not working. And you need to just override that by sitting down to work anyway, as if it was something you have to do every day. Because after you sit down, you're going to get started and things are going to get rolling. And if you can't think of anything to write that's new, you go back and edit what you've already written. So, yeah, I think it's important to write every day, and I think it's important to have a routine, and I think it's important. It works best for me to do it either first thing in the morning or in the middle of the night.
Now, for my final question, what attracted you to living on a sailboat, and what is it like to live on a sailboat?
I was looking for adventure at the time. I was about almost 1 year sober, and I was canoeing. I was on a solo canoe trip through the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia, and I kind of had this realization, like, this is what I need to be doing. Traveling by boat is so much fun. I love it so much, and that's the big adventure. I was trying to think of, like, what are the biggest adventures that I could do right now? And I just kind of realized, yeah, sailing, that's it. I'd sailed a little bit as a child, and it kind of these memories came back to me, and I thought, sailing, that's the big adventure. That's what I need to do. And I started reading books about it, and I got some experience, and I took a class. I spent the money I'd saved from not drinking beer for a year to buy a sailing class. That was actually one of my techniques to get sober, was to save money, to save cash, and put it in a box, and I was going to spend it all on something big after 1 year. And I bought a sailing class. What attracts me to it is the adventure and the travel, and the best part about it is that for me anyway, is that I'm living close to nature. And I think that was part of what made me into an alcoholic, and not just an alcoholic. I was a pothead too. I was totally addicted to smoking weed. It was a crazy life. Part of my problem was I was cut off from nature, And just living on land, a typical American lifestyle, living on land in a house in a town with a car and concrete and telephone poles and streets and buildings everywhere, you're cut off from nature, and that just made me unhappy. And I think I was trying to find a way out of that, and with and alcohol and drugs was a substitute. Anyway, living on a boat close to nature is a wonderful way to live for me anyway. For all of us that do this, we're all looking for that. There's a lot of people that live like this, and we're all looking to get closer to nature. We want to be free. We want to be able to travel and move. Living surrounded by water is fantastic. It's an adventure, and it's peaceful and quiet. You can move whenever you want. It's a wonderful life. It's not for everybody. Like, a lot of people would hate it. You have to be okay with giving up a lot of your creature comforts. I don't have air conditioning. I don't have a washing machine. I don't have running water. I collect rainwater to drink. But it's all quite comfortable for me, and it's absolutely beautiful. You can walk outside and look at the stars at any point. It's dark outside. Like you live in a house and you forget that it's nighttime sometimes, right? Because all your lights are on, and you're not. You step outside and there's more lights are on. But here on a boat, you step outside at night and it's dark, and you look up at the sky and the stars are out. And in the morning, there's dolphins swimming by. And at any point, you can jump in the water. You can put on a mask and jump in the water and swim down to the bottom and look at the fish down there. And get in my dinghy and go out to a coral reef and go spearfishing. At any point, I can do that. And here in Panama, when the surf is on, like there's surf all over the place. I can go surfing. There's adventure all around me. It's a beautiful way to live, and it inspires creativity. It really fits for me. I love it. And when you want like a big adventure, you can just take off and go somewhere, get out in the open ocean, and just go to a completely different place. And you've got big adventure at all time. And that's kind of what the people that do this life, that we need that. Like, people that love to sail and live on a boat, they need adventure. And if they don't have it, if we don't have it, we're going to find it somewhere else, and it might be in a bottle, or a pill or a bag of weed. So it's much more healthy to be out here doing it sober, and living the real life, getting the real adventure instead of that fake adventure that drugs bring.
Paul, you were a very interesting guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
I'll include a link to Paul's podcast in the text description of this episode. It was wonderful to be able to interview Paul, which simply would not have been possible without modern technology. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding you all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.